It is a real delight to welcome everyone to Westside today. We're just so glad that you're here. If you are visiting with us today, a special welcome. You're an honored guest. Due to the restrictions of social distancing, I really miss being able to congregate out in the foyer and shake hands with people and give hugs and just be up close to one another. I am still not mastering the elbow bump yet. In fact, I had two people trying to elbow bump me at the same time this morning. But we are glad that you are here. This morning I want to conclude a brief 4-part series from the book of Job that I've been doing throughout the month of January. In the midst of his pain and suffering, both physically and spiritually, Job cried out in Job 13, verse 3, "But I would speak to the Almighty. I would argue with God." Have you ever felt like that? Like arguing with God? Job's integrity was under assault. He had lost his wealth, his health, his family, and his friends were seeking to impeach his character. And in the midst of this, Job cries out, "I would argue with God." Job's friends had not been of any help to him. In fact, in the very next verse, Job 13, verse 4, he said that his friends had actually smeared lies, and he said they were worthless physicians. But Job certainly isn't the only individual throughout the Old Testament who, in the midst of despair, cried out to God. In Habakkuk, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, the 6th century prophet in Judah cried out, "Oh Lord, how long do I cry to you and you do not hear me? How long do I cry violence and you do not save? How long shall I look upon disease and see destruction?" And even David, who had such an intimate relationship with God, in Psalm 13, verses 1 through 3, cried out, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear anxiety in my soul and grief in my heart every day?" I imagine you've been there, haven't you? Haven't you experienced those times in your life when you've just cried out, "How long, O Lord?" We need to be reminded that the individuals pictured in the Bible were not superhero action figures. They were people like you and me, people with failures, fears, frustrations, people with problems and perils. They experienced the same anxieties, the same alarms that you and I experience in our life. And it seems to me that one of the greatest lessons we need to learn in life is the lesson that Job learned when he lifted his voice to argue with God. Let's first of all consider Job's argument with God for just a moment. In the midst of this pain and calamity which Job had experienced, and remember, Job didn't have the book of Job, so that he was aware of what had transpired behind the scenes in the conversation with God and Satan found back in chapters 1 and 2. Job was clueless as to all of that. So what we find throughout the book of Job is Job questioning God. He didn't question the existence of God, but he certainly had questions about what was happening to him. I want you to look at two passages here from Job 13, and then we're going to skip over a few chapters to Job 23. But here in Job 13, verse 15, Job said that he didn't really understand. He says, Lord, what are you doing? What are you doing? I would lift my voice to you, and I would prepare an argument for you. That's what he says. I am prepared to argue my case before you. And then down in verse 18, he says, I have my case prepared. I know that I will be vindicated. But the problems didn't stop automatically. Have you ever noticed? Often when we pray and ask God in the midst of our suffering, the problems don't necessarily go away immediately. And that was true for Job. They continued and they lasted. And so again in Job 23, Job says that my complaints seem to be his rebellion. His hand is heavy despite my grief. Oh, that I knew where to find him, that I might come into his home and present my case before him and fill my mouth with words of argument. Oh, that I might listen to him, to know what I could learn from him and to perceive what he would tell me. Job was saying, oh God, please help me to understand what is going on in my life. I want to show you something I actually brought this morning. Many of you know that as a hobby, I am an old radio enthusiast, and I rebuild and repair old radios. Now, this is just an empty case. The chassis is laying in about 25 different parts on the workbench in my shop. Whether they will all come back together, I do not know. But I enjoy doing this. For some reason, guys stopped where they got to where they would no longer take me hunting with them. And they even quit letting me play golf with them. So I needed something to do. So I'd always have this interest in these old radios. And when I start work on an old radio, the first thing that I do is I look and I find the model number. Tammy helps me, and we look that up, trace it down, and we buy or download what's called a schematic. This particular radio is a 1947 B.F. Goodrich Montola. Did you know that B.F. Goodrich actually sold radios back in the day? It actually was branded B.F. Goodrich. It was actually a General Electric radio. But we look up what's called a schematic. What is a schematic? It's a large diagram. And in that diagram, you find all of the different parts to the radio, the different components, the capacitors, resistors, tubes. You find out what their values are, where your radio frequency coils are, all of the other things, and you find out how it works. You're able to discover how the electric current flows into it, how it then is able to go through the process of detecting radio waves and converting all of that into an audio output sound. It's fascinating. This was exactly what Job was doing when he argued with God. He said, God, I want you to explain yourself to me. I want you to explain what's going on in my life. Tell me, God, what is happening? Have you ever said that? Well, now listen to God's response in just a moment. God's response is found in Job chapters 38 through 41. God has been quiet. Whoops. God has been quiet. Good. Maybe God will keep that there the rest of the time, and maybe he won't. Come up and get it, will you? Make yourself useful. Thank you, Rags. I love him, don't you? Elder in charge of fallen radios. Seriously, where is God? I really think that's the question that our society, our culture is asking today. Where is God? In the midst of COVID and pain, death, suffering, inconvenience, quarantine, where is God? God has been silent in the book of Job ever since the second chapter. We find God in chapter 1, verses 6 through 12. We find him in chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. But ever since that 6th verse of chapter 2, all the way up through chapter 37, God has been silent. Where are you, God? That's what Job wants to know. From chapters 38 through 41, 4 chapters, God speaks. We're not going to read all 4 chapters, but I want you to hear the prologue to God's response from Job 38, verses 1 through 11.
Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind and said, "Who is this who darkens the divine plain?" Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind and said, "Who is this who darkens the divine plain? Who by words without knowledge? Now tighten the belt on your waist like a man, and I shall ask you, and you inform me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the measuring line over it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who enclosed the sea with doors, when it went out from the womb bursting forth, when I made a cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling bands, and I placed boundaries on it, and set a bolt in doors. And I said, as far as this point you shall come, but no further, and here your proud waves shall stop."
As Job raised his voice in anger, or to argue with God, God said, Job, as he spoke to him out of a whirlwind, "You tell me, where were you when I formed the earth, when I laid its foundation, when I set forth its parameters?" Here in chapter 11, verses 1 through 38, he says, Job, where were you when I created the earth and everything in it? Where were you when I created the stars, the planets, the sun? These are questions that science has asked for centuries, and the best they've been able to come up with is boom. But God said to Job, where were you when I did it? And then in chapter 38, beginning with verse 39, all the way through chapter 39, verse 30, God said, Job, look at how I have designed the animal kingdom. Look at how I have created all of the different animals with their instincts and their intellect that they did not get from training. They received it because I created them that way. And then beginning in chapter 41, verse 1 through the end of the chapter, he says, Job, I'm sovereign over even the largest and most fearful creatures on the planet. The Leviathan, and others. You see, God never answered Job's question, but what he did do was reveal his majesty and his greatness. And in essence, he said, Job, I know what I'm doing. Trust in me. I know what I'm doing. I used to drive quite regularly. In fact, I drove all the time. I drove across town, drove cross country, and Tammy and I would be together. But a year or so ago, when I was no longer able to drive, Tammy began doing all of the driving. She assumed those responsibilities. I had a really hard time with that because I had always been the one in control. I'd always been the one with my hands on the wheel. And now that I had been relegated to the passenger seat, it was very easy for me, and I often did, say, watch out, there's a traffic light up ahead. Did you see that car coming? I can't believe you didn't see that. Now, many of you know my wife, and she is a very mild-mannered and even-tempered woman. But there came a day when she looked over at me and said, would you shut up? Don't you think I know what I'm doing? But I had the last word. I said, yes, ma'am. When you're going through pain and heartache in your life, the most difficult thing in the world is to take your hand off the wheel and say, God, I know you've got this. And that's what Job had to learn. And after God's response, Job replied in Job 42, verses 1 and 2, I know that nothing is impossible for you. That's the message of Job. That in the midst of life turned upside down, we may never understand all of the plans and schemes of God, but we can trust Him to do what is right. This morning, listen to Job. Put your trust in the Lord. Put Christ on in baptism today if you're not a Christian. And if you're a child of God today and you need to renew your faith, we ask you to come and while we stand and sing.